Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Debrief on ABC News Live. I'm Kimberly Brooks. Thanks so much for joining us. We have the latest on the new arrest in those deadly Sri Lanka attacks, plus some deeply disturbing molestation files from the Boy Scouts of America. And did you see that game-winning buzzer beater shot last night? All right, well, first, here are your headlines.
A driver's under arrest in Sunnyvale, California, after police say he deliberately sped his car into a crowd of people.
8 pedestrians were struck by a vehicle. The driver who struck the vehicle looks like it might have been an intentional act. All of that is under investigation at this time. The driver is in custody.
Video from the Connecticut police shooting of an unarmed couple appears to contradict the officers. Police from 2 different New Haven area departments responded. One said the driver made a threatening gesture, but the video shows him raising his hands. The man was not injured. The woman was wounded but is recovering. There have been protests over the shooting. Officials say they released the video much faster than usual to show transparency in the investigation.
And Jeopardy champ James Holzhauer has just crossed $1 million in total winnings. It took him 14 appearances to get there.
All right, guys, we begin with Sri Lanka. Now up to 359 people reported dead in those Easter Sunday explosions, and new details on the suicide bombers and the arrest. So I want to go to James Longman, who is still on the ground in Colombo. James?
We are back at St. Anthony's Church, where, of course, one of those massive suicide attacks took place. It's a few days after, but there's still a lot of sadness here. A lot of people just standing in the street staring at the church. I can't really believe what's happened. 359 people have been killed. It makes it the biggest, possibly the biggest single attack from ISIS anywhere in the world. When you think they were in control of enormous spaces in Syria and Iraq for so many years, that really is an extraordinary thing. We're also learning more about the people who are involved, like a woman. A woman was thought to be at the safe house to which police rushed after these attacks took place. They found her there. She blew herself up and she killed the 2 children who were there at the house with her, as well as 3 police officers. But the question has to be asked, how did police know to go to that house? And it has emerged that that property was owned by an individual whose other property back in January was raided by police, and 100 kilos of explosives found there. So it is extraordinary that not only did authorities here miss intelligence reports that were being given to them by their foreign allies, but that they also missed their own police work here inside the country. We know there were at least 8 suicide bombers led by a local cleric who developed links with the so-called Islamic State. And it is terrifying that although Donald Trump announced the defeat of the so-called Islamic State, ISIS, in the Middle East, they still remain a potent force able to carry out attacks like these.
All right, James, thank you so much. It's hard to imagine how you move on with your life after that. All right, guys, we want to give you the updates in the 2020 race. Looks like we're going to have candidate number 20. ABC has confirmed that former President Joe Biden will make his official announcement via video on Thursday morning. So Tom Yamas is in New York with more. Tom?
Kimberly, in the next 24 hours, Democrats will have a new candidate for president. Former Vice President Joe Biden expected to announce he's in it to win it. He's planning on releasing a video on Thursday, and we know he'll follow up with a campaign rally on Friday in Pittsburgh. Why Pittsburgh? Well, Pennsylvania is such a critical battleground state. It's a state that President Trump won, but it's a state where Biden grew up in, and part of his argument is going to be that he can win back states that Hillary Clinton lost. Now, we all know that Joe Biden's experience is vast, just like his voting record and his time in the spotlight, and some of that has already come back to haunt him even before he's announced. Several women accused him of crossing the line with unwanted kissing or hugging. Joe Biden has acknowledged this and says he will be more mindful moving forward. Now, as far as fundraising goes, he does have some catching up to do. Both Senator Bernie Sanders and Mayor Pete Buttigieg have raised a lot of money, and they've done it in small donations. Biden is expected to have a very big donor event right after he announces to show that he can also raise the money needed to run for president. If elected, right now he's 76. If he wins this race, he would be 78 years old, the oldest elected person president. Kimberly?
Thank you, Tom. And speaking of presidents, I want to go to Washington. The White House Democrats, they have subpoenaed the White House counsel Don McGahn to testify, but President Trump argued in a Washington Post report that he doesn't want his current or his former aides to testify. So I want to bring in Ben Siegel at our D.C. bureau. Ben, one of the biggest questions I think people have is who has the final say? What branch of government is ruling right now?
Kimberly, that's a good question, and I think it's one that people have different answers to depending on where they work in Washington. Obviously, Congress thinks that they have a prerogative to investigate what they want, and they have broad authority to conduct oversight of the administration and its actions, and especially after the Mueller report, they have a lot of questions. But the White House says the president, has his own prerogatives, and this is a legal battle that's been brewing for some time in Washington, and we could finally see it come to a head in the courts.
Yeah, and you mentioned Congress, but have they made in reaction to him saying he doesn't want anyone to testify?
Well, that was just overnight to the Washington Post, and you referenced that before. The president's argument, and we can pull some of that up, is basically that, if Democrats have questions, they can read the Mueller report. I don't want people testifying. That's what they're doing if they do this. Looking at what they said to Mueller, I mean, people spoke to the Mueller team, the special counsel's office, for hours and hours at the White House's request voluntarily. So to the president, anything else is sort of an effort to damage him politically. And of course, if you talk to Democrats on the Hill, they would say, and again, we referenced this before, but it doesn't matter if this damages the president politically. This is something that they're responsible to look into. They have concerns about obstruction of justice and some of the president's actions. McGahn, specifically, the former White House counsel, told the special counsel's office about several encounters he had with the president, where the president directed him to try to remove Mueller from office. So they have lots of questions about the obstruction here, and they say the only way to get those questions clarified is to hear from the person behind some of those encounters.
Yeah, and so as that's happening, Trump was also tweeting this morning about caravans heading for the U.S. border. What do we know about that?
That's right. That's immigration is something that this president feels very strongly about, and something he's felt very consistently about for a long time. And it's his perspective that there's not enough being done by Mexico and the U.S. government to stop people from coming over the southern border and to coming into this country illegally. So time and time again, you'll see this president return to this subject, something that resonates with his voters and he feels very passionate about. So we'll see if what that means in Washington, but obviously something the president feels very strongly about.
All right, Ben, thank you so much. We appreciate that. And guys, I want you to know this name. It's Kelly Tennant. That's the name of the woman who has accused Luke Walton, the Sacramento Kings head coach, of sexual assault in 2014. She has now spoken out and said it took her so long to publicize the allegations because of fear. So I want to go to Maggie Rulli, who's in Los Angeles, with more. Maggie?
Well, Kimberly, these are disturbing allegations against Luke Walton. Kelly Tennant, a former sports reporter, is accusing Walton of sexually assaulting her about 5 years ago. And at the time, she was just 25 and considered Walton a mentor. Now, Walton, if you're not familiar, is one of the most high-profile coaches in the NBA, has coached basketball superstars like LeBron James. Now, until recently, he was head coach of the LA Lakers, but is now with the Sacramento Kings. But this allegation dates back to 2014, when Walton was with the Golden State Warriors and was visiting LA. Tennant claimed she went to Walton's hotel because she had just written a book that he had supported her on, and she wanted to give him a copy to thank him. Now, she says he asked her to come up to his hotel room. She hesitated, but claims he told her he didn't want to stay in the lobby with the players and things would be okay. So she says she trusted him. Now, it was inside that room that Tennant alleges Walton attacked her. And Kimberly, I want you to hear it in her own words. She spoke at a press conference yesterday and described the alleged incident in graphic detail. Take a listen.
He got on top of me and pinned me down to the bed. He kissed my neck and my face and my chest. And as I kept asking him to please stop and to get off, he laughed at me. I thought he was going to rape me.
Now, Walton's lawyer is countering that, has come out with a statement saying he strongly denies the allegation and says Tennant is an opportunist, not a victim, and her claim is not credible, in a statement adding, "We intend to prove this in court." Now, police have told ABC News Tennant never reported the alleged assault to them, but Tennant spoke back about that. She says she waited these 5 years because at the time she was 25 and feared for her career. She had only been working as a sports reporter for about a year at that that point and thought it would jeopardize her entire future. She says she also feared for her safety, saying exactly that it would, quote, jeopardize every aspect of my life. But Kimberly, she's now saying time's up and that she's speaking out for the other women who have been in her alleged situation, saying, quote, if sharing my story makes another woman feel heard, that's what matters to me. Plenty more to come on this, Kimberly, I'm sure.
Thank you, Maggie, for those updates. And now we turn to an alarming story from the Boy Scouts of America. The organization had privately identified more than 7,800 alleged child molesters in its perversion files dating back to the 1940s, according to a victim's attorney. So I'm joined by Aaron Kontersky to understand this. Aaron, just to start, I want you to explain what these perversion files are and how all of this was discovered.
It's a rather unfortunate name given what's contained in them, but from, I don't know, World War I on, almost 70 years, the Boy Scouts have kept names of volunteers that have been accused of improper behavior with some scouts, and they put them into these files called the perversion files. And they've effectively stayed there for the last 70 years, but in more recent years, the existence of these files became known, and then the Boy Scouts, the organization itself, hired an independent auditor to start going through them. And this independent auditor testified in a recent court case about what she has found over the last 5 years. And that is that there are nearly 8,000 scout leaders who have been accused, rightly or wrongly, but who have been accused of sexual misconduct, and more than 12,000 victims.
It's so disturbing, and I think what's more disturbing is not just the numbers. The numbers are alarming, but the fact that it's been private for this long. How in the world can you keep this amount of information private for decades?
That's exactly what the attorney who ended up amplifying these findings said, that the scouts may have removed these people from being scout leaders, but they never alerted the communities. So that person may have been walking around the community and interacting with children in another way. And they want the Boy Scouts to do what the Catholic Church, or at least some states, have done with the Catholic Church, and that is to name names and put these names out there. The Boy Scouts said that in every case, they alerted, where appropriate, the police, in some cases prosecutors. It wasn't clear whether any of these people ever faced criminal charges.
Wow. Okay, so you're saying all of the names of these people will be disclosed at some point?
Some of them are already out there. The focus came in New York and New Jersey, where this attorney, Jeff Anderson, decided to go public with these names. Some of them have come out in court documents or in other research from news organizations. But eventually, the goal from this one attorney, Jeff Anderson, is to have all nearly 8,000 names identified in the name of protecting kids. Of course, he is an attorney, and he is looking for potential clients for lawsuits, and that may be part of this disclosure as well.
Well, one thing I have to ask you is, how do these victims even begin to seek justice?
It's no coincidence that the attorney decided to focus on New York for his initial disclosure of these findings from the independent auditor the Boy Scouts hired. Starting in August, New York law is going to change to make it easier for victims of abuse to try and sue, file lawsuits. The age limitation is going to be increased up to 28 years old. And so potentially the Boy Scouts is looking, come summertime, at a rash of new lawsuits that could be financially crippling from alleged victims of child sex abuse.
Wow, absolutely devastating. So many layers of trauma, and I think about all of those families. Aaron Kontersky, thank you so much for these updates.
And to be clear, the Boy Scouts said they too are thinking of the victims and apologized to anyone harmed during their time in scouting.
Yes. So now we are moving to Britney Spears. As we know, she had checked herself into a mental hospital, and just overnight she resurfaced on social media after a bit of a hiatus, saying all is well. So take a look at what she said.
Hi guys, just checking in with all of you who are concerned about me. All is well. My family has been going through a lot of stress and anxiety lately, so I just needed time to deal. But don't worry, I'll be back very soon.
All right, guys, so now I want to bring in Dr. Sobti of our ABC News medical unit. I just want to talk about people who are in the public eye because, you know, she's a human being and she's dealing with some issues right now, but how do people that are coping with something like depression maintain their privacy when no one's allowing them to be private?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kimberly, for having me. So I think in general, for anyone who has mental illness, it's important to find coping strategies that work for you. As far as recovering from mental illness, we know that the combination of therapy and medication can be very helpful for illnesses like anxiety and depression. And also having a good rapport with a therapist can sort of provide you with this private, safe space to talk about your symptoms, including how you're coping with that illness in the outside world, so in the public eye, for example. And I think that outside of the medical realm of things like medication and treatment, coping strategies like exercise, mindfulness meditation, and yoga can also be extremely effective for coping with a lot of the stress that comes with both being in the public eye as well as having mental illness. So I think that synergy is important. And the third thing that I can't speak to enough is the importance of social support, having a sort of sounding board to talk about symptoms and people that you can confide in to share your experiences and also to potentially seek help if your symptoms get worse.
Yeah, and one thing that I think is like a big misconception is that people think like, okay, when you're going through an episode, that once you're through it, that's it. Like you'll never experience any depression or something again, but that's not true.
Right.
Yeah.
So that gets to the idea of relapse. So a number of patients, while they're being treated for depression and anxiety, after a few months, as soon as 6 weeks after being started on a medication for anxiety, for example, I've had patients who start to feel better. And so sometimes there's a thought that patients think maybe if I stop taking the medication, I'll continue to feel well. So these patients come back to clinic and a lot of their symptoms come back in full force or relapse. So it's important to be in constant talks with your doctor and your therapist about how you're feeling, if your symptoms are starting to improve, to guide whether you'll be continued on medication, if there are different types of therapy that can be tried. Having that ongoing conversation is important.
And also to understand that it's okay to, like, there's nothing wrong with you that you're experiencing any of these things. It's not, there's no shame attached to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that because celebrities have come into the public eye, there's been sort of reduction in stigma around mental illness. And also, I think within science, the idea that there are biologic chemical changes in the brain that underlie a number of mental health illnesses, including anxiety and depression. So I think that's kind of helped with having this conversation, not only in clinic, not only with clinicians, but in the public eye. Absolutely.
And we know that Britney's sister, Jamie Lynn, she also put out a comment saying that she was defending her sister. So, you know, obviously Britney has family support, but what if you don't have a family or friends that are there for you? What are some other resources or outlets that you can use?
Sure, so that's a great question, and that speaks to the importance of social support in coping with mental illness. A lot of times the first step for people is admitting that they're having symptoms, admitting that they're struggling, and so there are a number of mental health hotlines that are out there, including SAMHSA, that are reachable, and sort of the first point of contact for a lot of people. They talk to clinicians and really tell them that they're struggling with these feelings of anxiety and depression, and the people who sort of feel the hotline oftentimes connect them with doctors, with clinicians who they can meet with moving forward, not only in the clinic, but also support groups for other people who are struggling with anxiety and depression. So I think that can be very helpful.
And lastly, before we go, I just want to get this in because it is World Immunization Week, and I want you to talk about the importance of vaccines as this country is dealing with a measles outbreak. So I think it's very relevant.
Absolutely. So this is the campaign that was launched by the World Health Organization. It's done every year in the last week of April. This year, the theme is #VaccinesWork. So we know that the vaccines in general work by helping our body mount a natural response to an infection and in turn protect us from severe infections in the future. There are 25 vaccines available that have been launched and promoted by the WHO, and these vaccines help to prevent potentially deadly illnesses and complications in high-risk people. Who are high-risk people? That can include young children and pregnant women. And we know that since this campaign was launched over a decade ago, that it saved millions of lives, including those of young children, pregnant mothers around the world. And they've also recently launched a new vaccine, so probably the 26th vaccine, which is the malaria vaccine, which has been shown so far to save 4 out of 10 children from developing potentially deadly malaria infection.
Dr. Sobti, a wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time and for joining us. Right now, I want to go to some sound from President Trump. This is his first time speaking since the Mueller report, and he just appeared on the White House lawn. So just let's take a listen to this really quick.
And they came up with no collusion, And they actually also came up with no obstruction, but our Attorney General ruled based on the information there was no obstruction. So you have no collusion, no obstruction. Now we're finished with it, and I thought after 2 years we'd be finished with it. No, now the House goes and starts subpoenaing. They want to know every deal I've ever done. Now Mueller, I assume, for $35 million, checked my taxes, checked my financials, which are great, by the way. You know they're great. All you have to do is go look at the records. They're all over the place. But they checked my financials and they checked my taxes, I assume. It was the most thorough investigation probably in the history of our country.
All right, so there you hear President Trump again speaking for the first time since the Mueller report was released. I want to bring back in Ben Siegel, who's in our D.C. bureau, and just get your thoughts on this. He's saying no obstruction, no collusion. What do you make of his comments there on the White House lawn?
Well, you see the president trying to use the ultimate findings from the special counsel as sort of vindication, as to really paint what Democrats are doing as an effort to go after him personally. He's saying there was nothing there and they didn't find any issues with obstruction. And of course, that's not exactly what Mueller's team wrote in their nearly 500-page report. They examined several instances of and detailed episodes where the president attempted to impede his investigation into whether his campaign was coordinating with Russia. Of course, there was no coordination that the special counsel found, but there were plenty of instances where the president worked to subvert the investigation into those matters. And there was a legal question that Mueller was dealing with, which is whether or not the sitting president can be indicted. And that was something that really colored his findings about whether the president did obstruct justice. Of course, that's a little more nuanced than the portrait the president is trying to paint here. And Democrats, one of the reasons why they want to look into this is to see what else they can do. And they say whether or not there should be any laws changed regarding the president and concerns about whether or not he broke the law.
Yeah, and we're seeing that live picture of the president right now boarding his flight to Atlanta to talk about opioids today, later today. Ben, one other thing I want to ask you about is he said in that comment, he said they've checked my financials. Is that true? I mean, he still hasn't released his tax returns. So what do you think of that?
Well, I don't know if that's clear. He seemed to think that they could have done that. He assumed that they did that. We haven't seen any evidence that that was part of the investigation. And we know he's bringing that up because he seems to be frustrated with Democrats who have asked for his financial information and also have requested his tax returns from the IRS. He's basically saying they're using these concerns that Mueller looked into as an excuse to go after his entire financial and personal business history. And again, in an effort to sort of smear him politically. And of course, Democrats, to their point, say that they have real concerns about whether the president makes decisions based on his best interest financially or the interests of the country. The president was the first in modern political history to not release his tax returns as a general election candidate. So this whole cloud is still hanging over him, and it's clearly really frustrating him.
All right, Ben, thanks for sticking with us to get your feedback. We appreciate it. So guys, we're going to end on a little bit of good news, amazing news after all of this heavy things, all these heavy things going on in the world. Everybody was talking about Damian Lillard last night, but not because of the 50 points he scored in the game. Take a look at this crazy game-winning shot he took to send his team to the next round of the playoffs.
Lillard wants the three. Oh my!
All right, and now you must check out the wave that he did at the end of the shot.
I mean, is that finished?
There you go.
Either way you look at it, if Damian Lillard taps off the game.
Yep, right there.
With a three-point wave.
It's basically like he's saying goodbye and step your game up. All right, guys, that was too good. So continue to take care of yourselves. And if you are around, you can stick around for the briefing room at 3:30 p.m. And then you can check out World News Prime at 8 p.m. And if you want to stay updated on all of these headlines for all of these stories, you can go to abcnews.com or download the app. I'm Kimberly Brooks, and I'll see you tomorrow.